Some people have the misfortune of seeing creatures beyond their wildest nightmares. Whether it's shadow beings looking to terrify you, or beasts of the wilderness that peek into your windows at night, there's no escaping from seeing the horrors that exist in this world. Tonight, we're going to cover 10 true encounters with unknown beings, so sit back, relax, and stay scared. Story 1. The Insectoid. I often wonder if all of us have been abducted at one time or another, but only a few of us can remember. I had a unique experience as a child, but I cannot say I was ever abducted. When I was 4 years old, we lived in a small wartime home in Hamilton, Ontario, on what we call the mountain, but it's actually just a slope. We had the windows open in the house, as air conditioners were not really the standard in 1968. It was sweltering that night. I shared a room with my brother and sister. I woke up during the night and looked out the window into the backyard, and in front of a bush, about 8 feet away, was a small, thin creature with shiny black skin. It looked like a little girl, but at the same time, it looked like an insect. It was crouched on its legs and was leaning forward with one hand on the ground and was looking directly at me. It had what looked like thin antennas, or like needles sticking out from each side of its head, and one on top. That's all I remember, and when I told my mom, she said it was a dream. We moved to Caledonia in no small house in 1972. I now slept in my room on the second floor. My dad and I did a project where we made a crystal radio. Some people may remember this kit from Radio Shack. I woke up one night in the summer with the windows open. I looked down into the backyard. I saw the antenna for my radio stretched across the yard, but below that, there it is again on the edge of the grass, crouched down next to the patio under my window. My mother said it was a dream. A few years later, we moved again, so my dad did not have to go far from work to Stony Creek, Ontario. I was now about 15 years old, and I got up in the night and looked out my window and saw it again crouched on the edge of the sidewalk and the grass in the front of the house. This time, I went outside to look, and it was there. I walked to them, and it did not make any noise. It just looked at me. It was all black with large black eyes. I then remember waking up and don't remember going back inside. I wrote it off to a dream. Many years later, I am not sure these were just dreams. There was an article where a UFO crashed in either Mexico or South America, and the sketches that the people made looked like my dream creature without the antenna, and the pictures showed red eyes, not black. The red eyes may just have been to jazz up the story. It makes me think though, has anyone else had anything like this happen to them? Story 2. The Glowing Thing. When I was a kid, about 5 to 6 years old, I had regular encounters with shadow people, especially at night, to the point where I would hate going to the bathroom alone at night, because they would just literally line the walls of the hallway from my room to the bathroom. They would just stare at me, despite having no facial features at all. With the shadow people, though, I never felt threatened, just unnerved. One night, I had to go to the bathroom, and my parents were asleep, so I was stuck going alone. I didn't see any shadow people that night, but I still kept my head down and walked quickly. As a kid, I also had anxiety about closed doors for some reason, so I left the door slightly open. I was just about to get up and go when the door slowly opened. I could hear footsteps down the hall, like someone with shoes on was shuffling on the floor, and I felt a powerful feeling of dread. I saw a faint blue turquoise glowing light from the end of the hallway, and then I saw a man walking sideways down the hall. He was walking like this, but way more smoothly, like he was gliding effortlessly, like it was the way he always walked. He was smiling and facing into the bathroom. He had brown hair, plastic kind of like a Ken doll, and he was wearing jeans and a turquoise button-up shirt. His arms were out at his sides. Strangely, he didn't seem fully there. His form sort of flickered with bits of color, like when you rub your eyes and see random colorful flashes. But he never disappeared or anything. He was very much real. I panicked and looked away and was just stuck sitting there, frozen until I couldn't hear his shuffling anymore. I looked down the hallway and he was gone, and I ran back to my room. I never told anyone for years, and I don't know why. I don't even think I told my best friend or brought him up when people were sharing ghost stories. Then, one day, my mom and I were out walking the dog, and the topic of how haunted our old house was came up. She told me that she had a lot of weird dreams there, but one in particular stood out to her. In the dream, she was in bed, and she was very aware that a bunch of people were in the house, and that she wanted them out. Then, she saw the same man walking the same way down the hallway. She got the same feeling of dread and wanted him gone as soon as possible. She didn't tell anyone about him, not my dad, not her sister, and she doesn't even know why either. When she told me about this, I almost started crying, and I felt a really intense feeling of dread. I still don't know why, but when I talk about him, I get choked up and I feel terrified, even though I've never seen him since. I don't know what he is or if he still exists, but neither of us had told anyone about him until that day. I've heard recently that some people report similar feelings of intense emotion when talking about aliens. If anybody knows what I could be dealing with, I would love some insight. Story 3: The Tree People. One Saturday in 2008, I had the strangest encounter of my life. My cousin Ann and I were exploring the woods of Turner, Maine. My grandmother always told of the tree people that she saw there as a child. I had never seen or heard of them since I lived in Maine, so I was very skeptical that they were there. My iPod was stuffed in my pocket, and Ann was studying everything we passed. She did believe all of Grandma's stories. Until we came to this orange fence in the middle of the woods. And the funny thing is, we did own all of this land. Mom and Dad would have heard about this. "Come on, let's jump over it," exclaimed Ann. She was overly excited. I sighed, but we made our way over the fence. As soon as we were over it, I felt like someone was following us. The hair on my back was standing up, and I didn't know why. I turned around to look back, but no one was there. Anne seemed fine, like she went here all the time. We were so far from that fence, my comfort zone. At one time, I was sure I saw 2 yellow-orange eyes just like the color of the wall. Super creepy. Suddenly, Anne yelped out, "What the hell is that?" I turned and saw a skinny, slimy, brown creature staring at us. It had the same eyes that I'd seen earlier. It reminded me of a walking piece of bark, to be honest. I was frozen. This thing made the hair on my head stand up. It made an awful scream that made my eardrums burst. I couldn't hear a thing for 5 minutes. The bark creature ran at such a speed that it was just a brown blur. Anne and I just stood there in shock, and we made a beeline for the house. The next evening, we did go out again, but the orange-yellow fence was gone. The questions were ringing in my head. Had we really encountered the dwelling tree people? Where could the giant fence have gone? I knew I wasn't dreaming because Anne remembers it too. I'll never venture that far into the woods ever again. Story 4: The Dark Walker. When I was a boy, my mother and I lived with my grandfather, who had a farmhouse in a rural location in southwestern Pennsylvania. My grandfather was a handyman who also worked a small blacksmith shop in his old barn. My grandmother had died before I was born, and my father had also passed away while serving overseas in the U.S. Army. Beginning in the summer of 1946, we noticed strange howling sounds coming from the woods that surrounded the property. The activity came at night and was very frightening when the howling came close. The sounds didn't seem to bother my grandfather, though. My mother and I were shaken when it would begin. The sounds continued off and on for about a year, but we never noticed any animals. My grandfather and I would hunt for deer and squirrel in the woods during the colder months, but we never saw signs of unusual animal activity. One late afternoon in the spring of 1947, I was helping my grandfather in his shop when I noticed something moving around the edge of the woods near an area where my grandfather had a few junk cars and other items. It was about 200 feet from our location, but I clearly noticed someone or something moving around. I told my grandfather to look. He walked to the door, lit his tobacco pipe, and didn't say a thing. After a minute or two, he turned around and got back to work. About that time, this thing moved into the woods and disappeared. I couldn't judge how big it was, but it sorta reminded me of a magazine picture I had seen of a giant ape that was said to inhabit the Asian jungles. Later that evening, I told my mother what I had seen. She was shocked because she knew I wouldn't lie to her and that the howling sounds had been closer lately. I also told her of my grandfather's response when I pointed the creature out to him. She immediately stood up and walked into the sitting room to ask my grandfather what it was. He started to shake his head slowly and said that he was hoping that we wouldn't see it because he was worried we would be and be scared and leave him. After assuring him that we'd never leave him, my mother again insisted that he tell us what this thing was. He looked away, took a deep breath, and said, "It's a dark walker," and said that it lived in the woods for many years. He said the native Indians called it stone spirit, and they thought it was an evil spirit who would appear when someone was about to die. The last time he had seen the dark walker was the night before my grandmother had died. My mother was skeptical of the harbinger of death angle, but she sensed that there was something unnatural nearby. The howling continued each night, though we hadn't seen any signs of the dark walker. One warm evening, we were sitting out on the back porch. There were a few howls, but it seemed like the sounds were even further away. We were listening to the radio when all at once my grandfather stood up and looked out towards the barn. He turned to me and said, "John, go get my pistol and ammo. Hurry now." I ran into the sitting room and grabbed the revolver and a handful of bullets from the old steamer trunk. I handed it to him and watched him load the gun. He then picked up a hatchet and slid it in his pants belt. "Now both of you, get into the house now." We were in the kitchen looking through the screen door and watched my grandfather stroll towards the barn. We saw him turn and walk out of sight into the dark. I decided to grab my shotgun and keep it nearby. After a minute or so, we heard 3 gunshots and a blood-curdling scream emanates from the woods near the barn. Then it suddenly stopped, and there was complete quiet. We were frozen and wondering if we should go look for my grandfather. A few seconds later, we heard him yell, "Stay in the house until I come back." I heard the pickup truck start. I looked out the storage room window and saw my grandfather drive to the back of the barn and park. Several minutes later, he backed up and drove by the side of the house out onto the road. I could see that there was something in the back covered up with a tarp. It was getting late, so my mother told me to go to bed. The next morning, I came downstairs and sat beside my grandfather, who was reading the newspaper and drinking a cup of coffee. My mother was sitting at the other end of the table, staring at my grandfather. Not long later, she said, "Well, Dad, tell him." My grandfather put the paper down and looked at me. "I killed the Dark Walker." And that was all he said. My mother told me not to tell anyone and that the matter was closed indefinitely. We never talked about it again after that. My grandfather lived another 15 years, and my mother stayed with him until his very dying day. When I grew older, I moved away and raised a family of my own. I would return home to visit each summer and never heard another howl. Story 5. The Chico, California Bigfoot. On Sunday, December 16th, my wife and I were driving through a residential area in Chico, California. It was around 11 p.m. We had been visiting a friend for the holidays. I'm not very familiar with the city, but at the time, we were on the Vallombrosa Avenue. On the left, there is a wooded park. We had just driven under the Golden State Highway overpass when suddenly, a large dark man-like creature leapt out from the woods onto the road. I quickly stopped the car as my tires screeched on the roadway. This creature was massive and had dark hair all over its body. I don't know how great the road is, but it was across 3 giant leaps. As it reached the north side of the way, it turned and looked directly at us. My wife was terrified and crouched down in her seat. I caught a brief golden-colored reflection from its eyes. I hit the accelerator quickly and continued driving. I had driven about 100 yards or so, and then noticed that either this creature was keeping pace with me, or that I passed another similar being on my left side, crouched down by the road. I still think that this was another creature, because it looked smaller in size than the beast I had witnessed previously. By this time, I was very concerned and extremely scared. I was hoping that there would be no traffic lights until we reached the turnoff to get onto the highway and get the hell out of there. Story 6. The Texas Werewolf. The following story happened to me in 2008, around 10 to 12 p.m. on the 29th. I, my friend Eric, sister, and her boyfriend had been hanging out smoking a few J's at a friend's house on Bicentennial. I was dropping off my sister's boyfriend, Ian, near Trenton Road, and as I was driving back south, I was talking to my sister that was sitting on the passenger seat, and friend that was in the back seat of my Chevy Blazer, but he was leaning forward in between my sister and me. As I was approaching Nolena, there was a red sedan driving in front of me, and we were both going at a steady 35 to 40 miles an hour. But right before I was nearing Walmart, the guy driving in front of me kept going slow until he made a complete stop on the road. I was mainly staring at the guy's taillights while we were driving, but when he made the stop, I said, "What the hell is this guy doing?" I looked at my sister and my friend, and they just stared frozen straight. The guy in front of me hauled ass, and my sister said, "Oh my God, did you see that?" As she started tearing up next to me. My friend yelled, "Dude, what the hell was that thing?" And we kept saying, What are you guys talking about?" My sister kept yelling at me to drive faster, but I was just confused about what the hell had just happened. Well, as the week went by and I got the full details about what happened back there, and apparently as we were approaching Walmart, there was this huge dog that looked like a pitch black Great Dane running across the street from east to west across 29th Street. Apparently, when the red sedan spotted it, it was near 5 feet from the car, so he made a full stop. My sister said the dog stood straight up on 2 feet and walked slowly in front of both cars as he was staring directly at our Blazer. As soon as it crossed to the sidewalk on the other side, he, or it, got on all fours and took off heading west near Ware Road. I personally didn't see a thing, but my friend said it was almost identical to the werewolf in Harry Potter, the Prisoner of Azkaban. Tall, skinny, pitch black, and very fast. I drive by a few times there, but I haven't run into anything since. Story 7. The Birdman of Illinois. About 15 years ago, my son, who was about 12 at the time, told me a story one day after I picked him up from his after-school friend's house. They lived right by a creek, and the boys always walked down the road to the stream to play in it. One afternoon, at about 3:30 to 4 o'clock, when the sun is still high in the sky but starting its descent, so it was a little blinding in their eyes, they were walking down the road to the bridge over the creek when they noticed a man standing on the way. Now, this is from the mouth of a 12-year-old. He said this man was just standing there, looked like he was all in black, and he said it looked like the man didn't have a neck. They were a little puzzled, but kept walking toward it. He said that is when it opened up its arms straight out, and it appeared to have wings. At that time, he said it just flapped them one time, like his arms went down one time, and he said it took off straight up in the air. They tried to see where it went, but said the sun was in his eyes. I don't know what to think at the time, but I just dismissed it as young boys and their stories. Well, when I started working nights about 11 years ago, I started listening to Coast AM and realized he had possibly seen the Mothman. Then he told me when he was in his early 20s, he was hanging out with some friends from a surrounding small town. They were telling stories, and one of the guys started talking about seeing this giant flying birdman thing. This is the very same area where my son saw it. They were both excited to meet someone else that had also seen what they had. Story 8. The Chupacabra. I'm from New York and live in Queens. Walking back home, just got off the subway, had a beer at a bar a few blocks from home. One block is unusually long compared to the rest. Half is houses with front yards and steps, decent Polish middle-class neighborhood. Half of this block is the back end of a big sports field. It's a small sloping elevation at about 15 to 20 feet tall and about 6 meters in length. Big tall fence in front of this one. As soon as I turn into this corner, I see something that resembles a human figure. It was just a sign in the shape of a cross with an arrow pointing left. I thought, what a good night to get abducted by aliens. Chuckle and think about a music project I'm working on. I get past the houses and I'm walking by the back side of the field. I hear something. A raccoon? I heard scramble of small feet, ruffling of some leaves, and quiet chittering. I keep walking and I listen to a struggle, wings flapping and a bird screeching in pain and grunts, and the sound followed me along, behind the fence. It was dark and I couldn't see anything. Some parts were blocked off with metal sheets. The sound was getting intense and loud. I could hear more animals dying, but also purring and cooing, like a pigeon or a cat chirping. Then there was a crow cawing and frogs singing, like if I were near a shallow swamp. I'm originally from South America and spent time in fields and whatnot, and it sounded like many, many, many animals. At first, I thought it was the chupacabra, but then I heard too many sounds, and I thought it could have been the devil. I even heard a woman moaning in the distance and a manly grunt next to me, and it followed me along the block. At the end of the neighborhood, there is an empty lot with another fence separating the two places. This thing went toward the top of the slope and climbed in the shortest wall. It took no time to catch up with me. I turn to the right in the corner, and this thing comes along, now snarling like a hungry dog. At the end of the empty lot, a raccoon jumps out through a hole in the fence. But the sound I could still hear as I walked away. It sounded angry. Mind you, this whole time I was terrified. I literally had chills running up and down my body. I moved out of the sidewalk and in the street, and I could still hear it. I'm finally out of this area and on my house's block. I'm shaking as I unlock the door. I genuinely do not know what I heard. Story 9. The Kenosha Wolfman. I live in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where werewolves have been sighted for centuries. I was walking back in May 2017, around 3 a.m., to a girlfriend's house. When I was close to her street, I looked behind a house with an alleyway in the back. I saw at first what I thought to be a huge deer, but when I looked closer, it was a big humanoid creature bent down sniffing. It turned its head. It was a wolf head. It was huge, so I looked even closer. It was a wolf-like man on 2 legs bent down. Did I tell you again how huge this thing was? I ran down the street because I did not want to go get its attention. In my mind, I wanted to go back, but something told me not to. Story 10. I don't know what this thing is. So, I don't know a lot about this sort of thing. Actually, I don't know anything. I just found this today and wanted to be able to share this with all of you. I've had well over 30 encounters with this thing, and I'm only 15, so I do believe. Anyway, I'll get on to this one. So about 2 years ago, I was playing the most recent Call of Duty campaign, and it was only 6 in the afternoon. But it was dark out because it was winter at the time. Now I'm in my room, sitting on a beanbag on the bottom of my bed, which is on top of the beanbag, which is on top of the bed, so this will be important. And my stepmother's sister is downstairs, and my bedroom door is open at this point. She walks past my room to go to the toilet, and as she steps out, she says, "Hi, Darren." Now, Darren is my dad's name, but he's not there. And so I say, "Dad's not here, what do you mean?" And she says she saw a humanoid figure sat next to me on the bed, but its legs were resting on the floor, knees bent, and he had long legs, and his head was the level height with me, who was sitting on a bed and a beanbag. Obviously, I noped the hell out of there, scared to even go in my room because this thing is tall, but I have yet to even see it. And then in the nighttime, I obviously have to go to sleep, so I go back to my room about 1 a.m., and I go to sleep with my TV on, so there's light in my room. I wake up at roughly 5 a.m. with an awful headache, and I look around my room. Nothing. A sigh of relief leaves me. But then I see it. Stood in one of the places that I didn't look. Literally, the height from the floor to the ceiling, and a little bit more as it was bent over because there wasn't enough room. It was all black. That black I couldn't even comprehend. Its face was entirely black, but I could see facial features somehow. Its eyes were as black as its skin, and its smile was terrifying. I stopped doing everything and just stared at it. Nothing happens for what felt like hours, although in real life it was about 12 minutes. It starts moving its head from side to side, sort of like a dog listening to a high-pitched sound, and then it seems to just disappear into the smoke and completely go. Not like a cartoon or movie though. Every time I tell someone about it on that night, I've seen it about 12 to 13 times, so it doesn't scare me as much as it should now. I picked up more and more of its features, like notably the fact that it has no hands or feet, just perfect stumps, which is just downright terrifying. The most recent time I tried to touch it, as it doesn't go for a good 10 minutes, and I was within a meter. So far it has no ill intentions. At first, my hand went straight through it, only I couldn't see my hand as it touched, as it was absorbed by the darkness. I take my hand out and feel it a second time, noticing my hand becomes very warm. Then I move something substantial as if right in the middle of it, almost like a spine but less spiky, but I'm just going off of what I could feel here. If anyone could tell me what the hell this thing is or what I could do to stop it. It only seems to appear when I tell people and it randomly shows up. Of course, nobody believes me, and it's driving me to the edge of insanity.